So the government announced today that it's going to seek to strengthen the law against hate crimes and hate speech with the intention of making it easier to secure convictions in the courts. Well, we'll be joined in a moment by Liam Herrick, Executive Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. But I want to start with Jennifer Carroll McNeil, the Fine Gael spokesperson for equality, also a member of the Oireachtas Committee on Justice. And Jennifer, what exactly is a hate crime and what is hate speech?
A hate crime is a crime that's motivated by hate based on a personal characteristic, whether it's religion, sexuality, colour, nationality, ethnic origin. And hate speech is speech that's designed to stir up or incite hatred. That's actually already a crime in law, but we're trying to strengthen the proofs and the evidence around both of these things. And if somebody commits a normal criminal offence, like an assault, for example, that's already legislated for, that's what I mean by normal, and it's motivated, or you can clearly see that there's a hate element to it, that it's because of or motivated by hatred because of somebody's physical characteristics or their personal characteristics, then what's going to be available is an additional, stronger sentence for the courts to use because the crime was motivated by hate as well as the actual crime itself.
So it's a sort of an aggravated offence, is it?
That's exactly it. So you'll get a stronger penalty for the same offence if it can be shown to the court or the jury believe that you were motivated by hate in the commission of the offence. That's the point of it.
But how do you prove motivation? Is that not very difficult to actually do? Is that a subjective thing as to how somebody was thinking at the time they commit a crime?
That is the exact conversation that we had in the Oireachtas Justice Committee. And what the Minister has done is, having listened to the academics, having listened to the contribution of members of that committee in the pre-legislative stage, she's taken the step of strengthening the law, not just from motivation, which, as you correctly say, is a sort of subjective what's in somebody's mind, but also to include a demonstration test. So if I were to commit an offence against somebody with a disability, for example, and at the same time were to use derogatory language about their disability, the fact of that, the demonstration of some ugliness or prejudice on my part while committing the offence, could be used as evidence. So irrespective of what's gone on in my mind, the very fact that I used particular language or behaved in a particular way that was related to hate based on one of those characteristics can now be used to show that it was in fact also motivated by hate, and that a stronger penalty is appropriate in those circumstances.
Could it be behaviour demonstrated at a prior occasion, such as things that might have been posted on the internet? Because I'm just thinking, for example, unfortunately you've seen with mass shootings in the United States that very often people who have carried out these outrages have posted material online prior to that.
No question that falls into the incitement to hatred side. So let's say, for example, you were to target a group in a violent way, and you had previously posted material that was linked to incitement of hatred of some kind, maybe based on ethnicity or colour or whatever it happens to be. A, doing so is a problem in itself, is an offence in itself. And B, even though that's not at the direct moment of the offence, I have no doubt but that a court would look at all of that as well and see what the overall motivation of the person was. Look, what's the point of this? It's about trying to stamp out hateful speech. It's about trying to stamp out prejudice and discrimination and to create a more tolerant, inclusive, equal society, and to try to really get at the very negative things that we can see from time to time, racial abuse, personal abuse, gender abuse, and target those and make very clear in law that those things are absolutely not acceptable, and to give our courts additional powers to add to people's sentences where crimes of that kind are committed.
But how do you make sure that if you're trying to clamp down on hate speech, that you don't clamp down on free speech?
It's always been a tension right across Europe, right across the United States. Just because you have the entitlement to free speech doesn't mean that you can say absolutely anything if what you're saying is going to engender hatred or violence to another person. Speech is always limited in that sense. Right across, I think maybe the best example is often Germany, where it is not acceptable to deny that the Holocaust happened, where so much of what came in World War II came originally from a failure to clamp down on free speech, to limit free speech. And so there are very strong rules in relation to hate speech in Germany in particular. And it's an example that's so easily understood. countries. The same is true across the United States. You have to try and monitor not just online abuse and hatred, but speech that is likely to incite violence, likely to incite hatred. So it's not an unlimited freedom. Yes, you have the freedom to say what you want, but there are and always have been limits to that, not just in Ireland, but right across Europe, right across developed democracies generally, who are trying to stamp out very, very, very ugly fringe elements that target people because of their characteristics. And we say that's just not acceptable. It's never been acceptable.
Liam Herrick from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. Would you share Jennifer's confidence that this distinction between hate speech and free speech can be clearly made?
I think it's certainly possible, Matt. I mean, I think the real test, of course, will be when we see the text of the legislation. So we're discussing today the Minister's statement of intention, but we will have to wait and see in September when we see the actual legal language. There's a number of very complex and technical legal questions that need to be addressed here, and we'll need to see the detail. Our preference in the Irish Council for Civil Liberty and indeed the wider civil society coalition against hate crime would have been to separate out the question of hate crime in one piece of legislation and incitement of hatred in another piece of legislation. Why? Because the rights issues are slightly different. The government has decided to join them together, and I think that just means we're going to have to be very careful in making sure the balance of rights is well struck. Now, the Minister, and in fairness, the government over the last couple of years in this, has consistently emphasised that there'll be very strong protections for freedom of expression. We take that at face value, and we think that that's certainly possible. And I think we'll be watching carefully to make sure that when the text comes out, the defences for somebody who might believe that they are, for example, engaged in journalistic expression or political expression, that the defences for reasonable freedom of free speech will be strong.
OK, and what do you make of the declared intention to make it easier to secure convictions in the courts?
Well, I think it's a little bit disappointing, I think, that we would be having as our goal here to get more convictions or get longer sentences. I think the real goal here must be to get a better understanding of the problem of hate crime in society so the guards can record it and understand it better, and ultimately to reduce its frequency. So I think that convictions shouldn't be the objective. We should really be trying to reduce the level of hate crime in society. Hate crime is a type of offence that is intended to intimidate and silence certain communities. And in the last number of months, we've seen some extreme cases of murder and other very serious crimes being committed against people because of who they are. So we have a problem here like every other society has. But I think we can focus on the legislation, but the legislation will only be the starting point. What we'll need to follow then is an investment in education, awareness raising and prevention. And I think that really will be the core of the government policy here. It'll be the preventative elements rather than the conviction and punishment parts.
OK, Jennifer Carroll McNeil, talk to me about these conviction and punishment part. Why are you placing the emphasis on that in the legislation?
Well, because that's what legislation does, in the same way that it prohibits murder and provides sentences for murder. But if you go back to the debate actually in November last year, what I said there was this is about behaviour. It's about trying to influence behaviour generally. We don't want people to kill people, obviously, but we have legislation to provide what happens in circumstances where they do. Behaviour is influenced by seeing some incidents going through court and hopefully having a deterrent effect. Behaviour is influenced by the government stating clearly that these things are absolutely not allowed, and we've strengthened the legislation in respect of it. I don't want to have legislation that can't get convictions. There's no point in that, and that's why I'm glad the Minister has taken the recommendation and strengthened the legislation. But I'd much rather if none of these events happened in the first place. I don't go about targeting people because of their race, their nationality, their religion. I don't need legislation to tell me that. And neither I suspect does Liam or do you, Matt. But we still need to be very clear that we have a growing problem, not just in our society, but right across Europe. It's appropriate that government respond with legislation in the way that it can. Legislation is about prohibiting certain things or mandating them. But Liam is absolutely right. There's a complementary policy around education. There's a complementary policy around inclusion. But you must have strong legislation as well, and legislation that's guaranteed to be able to get convictions where the court and juries deem it appropriate. And we think that providing this additional test of demonstration as well as motivation strengthens the capacity of courts to manage that process and to get convictions where appropriate.
I'm looking at the list of protected characteristics: race, colour, nationality, religion, ethnic or national origin, sexual orientation, gender, disability. But it strikes me, should certain jobs and professions be included? And I'm not being smart when I say politicians, because we have seen, unfortunately, a number of politicians murdered in the United Kingdom over the last 5 or 6 years. Is there, perhaps given the abuse that many politicians take as well, simply because you are politicians, a need for particular types of job to be included?
I'd be very careful with that. I think one of the huge advantages that Ireland has is the connection of politicians to their local communities. It's a very connected politics, and the benefits of that hugely outweigh any negatives. You'll be aware that there's a court case involving me, for example, and there are court cases involving other politicians who have been at the receiving end of inappropriate content or inappropriate conduct generally. But I would still say that what's most important is that our politicians are connected to people and that they're not put in a special class. However, there is no question but that the untruths that are told on social media and the vitriol and the aggression can have, and I believe does have, a detrimental impact on our democracy, which is one of the strongest around the globe. We have a really good democracy, and we have it at risk of the sort of the display of untruths that are so prevalent on social media. For example, on social media, it seems to be an established fact that I got a corrupt contract from my brother. Matt, I don't even have a brother. Do you know what I mean? It's this sort of things, and it degrades, whatever about it degrading me or politicians like me, it degrades democracy generally, and whoever are the people that hold the seat that were given to them because their community chose them to have that for that period. We have a really strong democracy here, and we have to protect that. That, to my mind, keeps politicians at the heart of their communities, right among them, and you don't create distinct classes for them. But we have to recognise that casual commentary on social media, vitriolic commentary on social media, not just has the effect of maybe putting really good people who might want to come into politics, really good women who might want to come into politics into that sphere, but it also has the effect, I believe, of damaging our democracy generally. And I just think it's something we need to keep watch of. Okay,
to finish with you, Liam Herrick, on something slightly different. We've seen recent months, it seems like, a rise in the amount of attacks on people, assaults because of their sexuality. How disappointing is that, given that we have had, it seems, a major transformation in society, particularly through referenda with the Marriage Equality Act and various other things, that we have got to this situation where it seems that we have assaults on the basis of hate crime? How are we failing in our education with that?
I think it's certainly very distressing and very disappointing, Matt. And I think that there has been good leadership from government on this, particularly from the Taoiseach, emphasising how seriously the government takes this issue. This legislation is part of the response, but I do think we need to have a long, hard look at how an issue that we thought was in decline seems to be in resurgence again. What we're hearing from agencies such as An Garda Síochána is that they need strong legislation as a platform for them then to develop effective policies of outreach, recording, training and so on. So I think this is only the starting point. The key here will be for the government and the Oireachtas to engage with communities that are affected by hate crime. And we haven't had much consultation with those groups yet, but there's an opportunity here in the autumn, when the legislation has been considered by the Oireachtas, to bring in the affected communities, to hear their experiences and allow them to have a voice in shaping the legislation. I think that is very possible, and I think with the goodwill from the government we can get a good response. But indeed, the assaults in recent months just show the urgency of this problem.
Thank you very much, Liam Herrick from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and Jennifer Carroll MacNeill, Fine Gael spokesperson for Equality and a member of the Oireachtas Committee on Justice.